Hi, everyone. Welcome to My Weight Live. Tonight, we're going to be talking with obesity specialist Dr. Sean Wharton. Dr. Wharton is the co author of the Canadian Adult Obesity Clinical Practice Guidelines, which were released in August. And he's going to be sharing his expert perspective on a whole bunch of issues related to weight and health. It's going to be a great show, but before we get started, folks, tell me where you're watching from tonight and what's on your mind. I'm so glad you're here with us. Dr. Wharton, it is an honor to get to speak with you this evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Ainsley.
So, I want to start by talking about something that I think is the number one frustration for so many people when it comes to weight loss. We work hard, we lose weight, but over time, many of us end up gaining the weight back, sometimes more, and lots of people tell us they've been caught in this cycle more than once. Talk a little bit about why weight regain happens and what we can do about it.
So, what we see is that there's a short term amount of weight loss that usually happens, but then with that short-term weight loss, there's a cascade of neurochemicals and hormones that are generated by the body and the brain to say, I don't like this weight loss. I want to regain it, and I want to regain even more weight than you previously lost, just in case you try to lose this weight again. I'll get some extra weight on so that it makes it even harder. So our body fights back against weight loss all the time. So we have to all recognize that this is part of the biological process, that whenever we're trying to lose weight, we're fighting against neurochemicals and hormones that want to regain weight. This doesn't mean that we cannot get weight loss and keep it down over the longer term, but it does mean that the battle is against these neurochemicals and hormones to keep the weight down over the longer term.
So, what I hear you saying is it's not our imagination. The battle is real. And we're going to talk about some of the things we can do to kind of combat kind of our body's response. But first, let's do tonight's trivia question. Folks, if you answer tonight's question, you will get some delicious holiday recipes. These are traditional favorites that our dietitian has upgraded to be just as tasty, but a little more nutritious than the usual version. Definitely something you want to download and check out, and you will get it for free if you answer tonight's question, which is, according to the Canadian Sporting Goods Association, which province in Canada is the most active? Is it A, Quebec, B, British Columbia, or C, Manitoba? Even if you're not sure, put your answer in the comments, and just for answering, you will get those delicious holiday recipes. Okay, Dr. Wharton, let's say that someone watching at home has lost weight and really wants to maintain it. What do the new guidelines and your kind of professional experience tell us about what's been proven to help people maintain weight loss over the long run?
The evidence really starts with being compassionate and having empathy. The person themselves has to recognize why they're actually doing it. What's the value behind what they're trying to actually do? So before we go to all of the specific therapeutic interventions, the most important aspect is, why are you doing it and who are you doing it for? When you wake up in the morning, who cares about you? Who do you feel is important in your life? Who do you love, and why are you doing this? So those values are abilities to be able to keep you on track. When we go into the very specific ways that you can keep the weight down, those all work, but they only work when you have that long-term value as to why you're doing this in the first place.
I'm so glad you talked about that, because I think kind of focusing on our why, none of these behaviors are easy. It can be hard to eat well. It can be hard to fit exercise into our day. So I think really focusing on the big picture and why we're doing this in the first place is a great place to start. Thanks so much for getting us started there. What has been proven? What do the guidelines tell us in your experience also? What does work for losing weight and keeping it off over the long term?
Many people want to have a simplistic answer. They want to reduce it to one or two things, but it's a very complicated reason as to why the weight went up in the first place. It's very complicated and biologically, physiologically connected to why the weight doesn't stay off and goes back up. So therefore, our answer, unfortunately, also is complicated. We've tried to whittle it down into 5 main things. So the first thing is medical nutrition therapy, which is not a diet, because we've used the word diet too many times and it has negative connotations to it. It's eating healthy. So that's number one. Activity is number 2. So be moving more than you did yesterday. Those two things are very positive. And everybody kind of knows about this, eating less and trying to be more active. But then we come to the three pillars that actually sustain these activities of medical nutrition therapy and activity. And those three pillars are psychological intervention, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, pharmacotherapy, or the use of medication, and finally, bariatric surgery. So that's what really works.
And I think so much of the time, when we in society think about weight loss, we just focus on those first two things, kind of diet and exercise. But as Dr. Sue Peterson says, for most people living with obesity, those things alone aren't going to be enough. All right, so you wrote a chapter in the guidelines, and in that chapter, you talk about the genetics that play into weight, and you also talk about the role that the brain plays in determining our weight. So tell us, what is that role? How does the brain affect our efforts to lose weight and keep it off?
I think it's really important that people understand that the brain is the primary organ that controls weight. When we talk about other medical diseases, such as diabetes, for instance, we know it's the pancreas that is in control of insulin and a number of other hormones. When it comes to weight, it is all about the brain. The brain wants you to keep as much weight on as possible to be able to survive during the famine or to regain weight after you have gotten sick. So what are those parts of the brain that actually do it? The main part is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does something we call homeostasis. Homeostasis means that so homeo is living or life, and then stasis is keeping that stable. It tries to control the weight so that your weight is as high as possible for the survival in the conditions that you happen to be living in. And our genetic brain continues to think that our conditions are horrible and a famine is actually coming. So that's the homeostatic or the hypothalamus part of the brain. The other part of the brain is the hedonic part of the brain that just really loves food or really loves pleasure. So above and beyond just getting past the actual hunger, we actually end up taking in extra calories because we really love those components. Now, that part is a survival part also. It's just not a hedonistic pleasure part. Is the more that you could like a pleasurable act that keeps you alive, the better chance the species will stay alive. So the hedonic part of your brain is responsible for eating. So those two parts, the hypothalamus and the hedonistic part, combine to keep weight up as much as possible. And then we have the third part of the brain that is part of this, and that's the executive lobe. The executive lobe says, I better not have too much fun or things may end up going south. And that executive lobe really only works when we have had a lot of rest and when it's working in a proper manner, when we're not overthinking, when we're not stressed. So that's the only mechanism that we have to try to stop those parts of the brain from overeating. So three parts of the brain: the hedonistic, the pleasure part; the hypothalamus, the homeostatic part, getting rid of the hunger; and then the executive lobe, which tries to counteract those two parts to make things a little bit better when it comes to keeping weight down.
Okay, Dr. Wharton, I want to drill in there on what you were talking about with the executive lobe, because I think that's the part of the brain that controls what we traditionally think of as willpower.
Yeah, correct. The executive lobe is the willpower part of the brain. It's our cognitive functioning. And so you can, of course, willpower your brain to keep your eyelids open for a couple seconds longer, right? That is the executive lobe functioning. And so, but eventually what happens is the hypothalamus ends up taking over for really critical type of things like blinking. Now, so that's a really nice example of how the cognitive lobe works for a little bit of time, and then the hypothalamus ends up taking over. Now, when it comes to eating, our executive lobe or the cognitive lobe can take over for a longer period of time if we train it. And that's what we need to do when it comes to elevated weight. We need to train our brain to control the hunger, sensations, the cravings, the hedonistic pleasure activities that we're seeking when it comes to food. We can actually train our brain, and that's executive lobe cognitive behavioral training.
All right, so that's exactly what you were talking about earlier with behavioral interventions as cognitive behavioral therapy. Give us just a quick example of what that might look like, of kind of training that executive lobe, maybe to give us a little more willpower in situations where it might be useful.
One of the first things we need to know is that if you put yourself in a vulnerable position, it's very difficult for your executive lobe to overpower it. So if you don't eat throughout the entire day and you are really hungry at nighttime after your brain is exhausted, you have no way of winning. You're not going to win the battle against the hedonistic lobe and the hypothalamus lobe. So, preparation is one of the most important things. And so, many people need to eat on a regular basis throughout the day. Think about what they're actually going to be eating, more protein, more fiber, so they feel more satiated, and also recognizing those vulnerable time frames. So we know in the evening are vulnerable times because the brain is tired, it doesn't have enough oxygen, and we give in to hedonistic type of behaviors. So once you recognize that this is a vulnerable time, we're now in a position where we can think of other things we can do to temper that hedonistic lobe.
Well, I'm so glad you're talking about this because I think some of us feel like, I just don't have any willpower or I'm weak. But what I hear you saying is that, you just don't want to tax that executive lobe too much. There's just only so much it can do. So trying to avoid temptation, trying to not put yourself in a situation where that executive lobe is just going to get worn out quickly is really the key. It's not our fault. It's just a matter of the way our brains are set up.
Our brains are designed to be able to get as much pleasure as possible in the vulnerable time frames. So, so really, we do have to focus on not giving ourselves those difficult times. And the idea is to prepare as much as possible. And the thing is some people are more vulnerable than others. So when you recognize what your vulnerable times, what your vulnerable triggers are, you then need to either write them down, be cognizant of these vulnerable times, these vulnerable situations. For some people, it's going into the kitchen. For some people, it's grocery shopping. It's going to a restaurant. For some people, it's sitting down at 9 o'clock in the evening in front of Netflix.
Yep.
That's their vulnerable time. If that's it, then you've got to adjust and shift things so that you're not susceptible to that to the vulnerability. We are fallible. Our brains are designed in a very specific way. So if you want to be able to prevent the behaviors that you don't want to do, preparing for it makes it really, really possible. We can actually beat it.
I love that. All right, folks, as you're hearing us talk about the guidelines, if you're curious to learn more about them, we're going to link to several great resources in the comments to be sure to check those out. And if you're listening to Dr. Wharton thinking, gosh, this guy knows a lot about weight and obesity, I'd love to see him or a doctor like him. We are going to put a link to our physician locator in the comments as well, where you can see specialists all over Canada who really manage obesity as a chronic disease. All right, so in the guidelines, there's also a lot of conversation about the environmental factors that can make weight difficult to manage and weight loss tricky to maintain. Things like increased availability of ultra-processed foods, more stress in our lives, less time to cook at home. How do you recommend we kind of play defense to help ourselves reach a healthier weight and keep that weight off over the long term?
What we know is that it's going to be a very difficult battle against the food industry. So trying to battle the entire food industry is a little bit of a challenge, but it's an important one. We need to do it. We need to not give up on stopping the excessive commercials or the amount of sugar in different foods and preservatives. So let's keep on battling. On a day-to-day basis, if a person recognizes the value of what they are doing, why am I doing what I'm doing? And if I'm trying to be healthy and ensure appropriate weight management, I will not drive by the Kentucky Fried Chicken on my way home. I will find a different way home so that I'm not triggered. I will not go to the grocery store when I'm hungry, because when I go to the grocery store when I'm hungry, that's when I buy all the carbohydrates. So those are ways that we can deal with these environmental challenges. They're all cognitive behavioral skills. There's no other significant way for us to really deal with it besides thinking about the values to what it is we're actually doing.
Gosh, those are all fantastic examples. I'm so glad you brought them up because those are really concrete strategies of things we can do to try to mitigate some of that. That's wonderful. For those of you who have just joined us, we're here with obesity specialist Dr. Sean Wharton talking all about the new Canadian obesity clinical practice guidelines and how we can reach our best weight. And in case you missed it earlier, we are giving away our dietitian's makeover of several delicious holiday recipes tweaked to be a little healthier. You can get those recipes for free if you answer tonight's trivia question. That question, in case you missed it, according to the Canadian Sporting Goods Association, which province in Canada is the most active? Is it A, Quebec, B, British Columbia, C, Manitoba? Dr. Wharton, one of the big takeaways from the obesity clinical practice guidelines is that stigma towards people living with obesity and weight bias in general, they're not just unkind, they can actually lead to weight gain and worse health for people living with obesity. So talk about what weight bias is and how it can make living a healthy life harder.
So, addressing the issues of bias and stigma in obesity are really important. And that's why it's the first chapter in our guidelines. We couldn't have moved forward with other chapters without addressing this. Bias is if you see somebody who's 250 pounds and you automatically say to yourself, they don't have enough willpower. What are they doing going into that fast food restaurant? That is bias. Everyone else can go into a fast food restaurant, or that person who's 250 pounds may have been 350 pounds previously, and they're down 100 pounds and working really hard to actually keep that off. So, but again, most people think this way. We all do. We're all biased. Everybody listening to this is biased, and I'm biased as well. So the issue is how do you deal with that bias and how do you not act on it? Acting on your bias leads to stigma and then discrimination. So what you want to do is you want to do the best you possibly can to know that you have bias, just accept it and possibly work on it the best that you actually can, and then do everything you can not to act on your biases. Not acting on your bias means not telling somebody who has elevated weight to just exercise and eat a little bit less, get it together. Those words, get it together, not to be used when it comes to patients living with elevated weight. The idea of using compassion and empathy, understanding biology, and that there's genetics and that there's a struggle is what you want to do to be able to deal with bias, stigma, and discrimination. Without dealing with that, you will not be able to address elevated weight. Patients won't be able to move forward with the right treatment options. So let's deal with that first.
What should someone say if their doctor says eat less, move more is the solution to their challenges with weight?
The way to deal with that is to give them the information and the evidence that comes from a reliable source. So not from just Dr. Google, but from 60 healthcare providers and researchers and academics across Canada who've put together a guidelines. So the guideline was written so that patients could actually take the document to their doctor and say that I understand that your recommendation for me is to eat less and exercise more, and I've been working on that as much as I can. But there's also some evidence here that talks about biology and physiology and some actual evidence-based recommendations that we haven't talked about that I would like to actually look at. If you could guide me in this, that would be very, 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 very helpful. And I think that that's where how we can address issues of bias. So bias and stigma are very similar to prejudice and racism. And frequently, the only way is education. So the doctor is not going to magically not be biased anymore and not say exercise more and eat less. They're not going to do that unless they're armed with evidence that there is something else, that there's other contrary information, there's genetic information, there's hormonal information. So they need that education to get past them acting on their own biases.
Folks, Dr. Wharton is sharing such great information here with us tonight. If you're inspired to learn more from other medical experts while you're in the car or on a walk, check out our podcast. We have in-depth interviews with physicians, dietitians, and psychologists on a wide variety of topics related to reaching our best weight. Just search My Weight What to Know wherever you listen to podcasts, and we'll put a link in the comments too. Dr. Wharton, last question. In the guidelines, there's a lot of discussion of all the benefits of modest weight loss, even as little as 1 kilogram. Can you talk about the benefits of losing even small amounts of weight?
So what we know is that as you get older, you tend to gain weight. Just staying weight stable means that you did something and that is an improvement in health. Getting your weight down even further, if you're even going down 1 kilo, or which is about 2.2 pounds, you're going to get an improvement in your blood sugars. And you can go from the pre-diabetes stage into the normal glycemic range, where your blood sugars are actually normal or not pop into that pre-diabetes stage. Now, I do recognize that many patients see this idea that we talk about modest weight loss equals health changes, but they say, thank you, that's really good. I want that health outcome and that small amount of weight loss, but I want more. And am I wrong for wanting more? And I would say absolutely not. You're not wrong for wanting more. So some people have very lofty, lofty goals, which are somewhat unachievable because of the way that the body works and the way that the brain works. But it is reasonable for people to ask for further amounts of weight loss.
So if someone wants to kind of move beyond that, modest weight loss that was possible before, what would you recommend that they do? Seek medical attention and talk to a physician about the tools available?
The interventions that we know that actually get the weight down beyond modest weight loss or just staying weight stable really involve talking to a healthcare provider. So, and because those three pillars are psychological intervention, which should be done by a professional. Next is pharmacotherapy, actual prescription medication. Again, a physician would have to write a prescription for you. These medications work. And then finally, again, something that you need to talk to a doctor about is bariatric surgery. So if your weight is very elevated, then bariatric surgery is a very successful intervention that changes the hormones within the body and allows the body to use those to keep the weight down and to use the extra calories. So yes, I do believe that if you want beyond modest weight loss, you need to talk to a healthcare provider and they can get you there.
I love it. Wow, we have learned so much tonight. Dr. Wharton, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, Ansley.
And before we end tonight, here is the answer to tonight's trivia question. Which province in Canada is the most active? A, Quebec, B, British Columbia, C, Manitoba. The answer is B, British Columbia, with 86% of households saying they participate in physical activity at least once a week. For those of you who are curious, walking is the most popular activity across Canada, and it's certainly my favorite too. If you didn't answer trivia, but you'd still like those holiday recipes, leave a comment for us and tell us what you thought of tonight's show or any questions it prompted for you. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight, and be sure to join us next time, Tuesday, October 27th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be talking with dietitian Jennifer Brown all about food and nutrition myths. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and take good care. Good night.